Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to start by mentioning an incident in my own life here in London that I had as a child that resembles, in certain respects, in its naivete, today's Arthur. When outside in one of the gardens of the Blakeney estate, as a young boy of 7, I noticed a tomcat, of whom I was very fond, on top of another cat. And he seemed to be biting her on the back of the neck. Of course, never having seen this behavior from him previously, and appalled at his brutishness, I quickly pulled him off, scolding him not to do anything similar again. He in turn merely looked at me, baffled. Now, if we pass to your 21st century, in North America, we find that our author, Dr. Thomas Sowell, was also possessed of a similar naivete as a child. Seeing his pet dog Bruno for the first time trying to wean her pups by walking away from them when they wanted to nurse, and thinking that very cruel, he jumped on top of her to stop her. Of course, the necessity of her actions was soon explained to him. All this happened in North Carolina, where not a few years earlier, little Thomas's personal Odyssey had begun. Still in the womb, his father, aware of his own deteriorating health and that his wife wouldn't be able to shoulder the burden of a 5th child alone, asked an aunt whether she might raise him. Aunt Molly assented to his father's request, and as soon as the little newborn appeared, he was brought to her house, there to be raised with her 2 daughters, Bertie and Ruth. Little Sowell was given lots of loving attention, in addition, not only by Bertie's boyfriend, Lacey, but also by his patient stepfather, who was so protective that he almost came to blows once with a pedestrian who had pointed his cane in Thomas's direction while giving directions to another pedestrian. Thomas was, from the beginning, curious to explain the world, and when Aunt Molly and her elder daughter Ruth brought him to the house of white folks, and he saw for the first time one of their sinks with 2 faucets, he remarked, "They must sure drink a lot of water around here." Even more surprising, he was told that most of the people in the U.S. were white. But almost impossible to believe, as was shown in the Sunday Funnies, was that some whites allegedly had blonde hair, he eventually marrying one. Thomas's active history with the opposite sex, unsurprising given his handsome face, athletic body, and sparkling intelligence, began early when a girl in his neighborhood, to show her affection, would pat him on the back, thus greeting him. To show her that the feeling was mutual, on the next occasion they met, I turned and enthusiastically pounded her on the back as she passed. She collapsed like a house of cards, got up crying, and ran home. She never spoke to me again, and I was heartbroken. It was not the last time I was baffled by the opposite sex, nor perhaps they by me. The family soon moved from North Carolina to the Big Apple, and between the busy New York City traffic, the new school where he found himself near the bottom of the class, and the need to often defend himself against accusations of being a dumb Southerner, adapting to life in Gotham was a constant challenge. As he said, at one point getting home for lunch safely became such an ordeal that a friend would lend me his jacket as a disguise so that I could get away before anyone could spot me. Sowell was sometimes justly, sometimes unjustly, held responsible for unattributed mischief in class. One time, a teacher pursued him as he ran away on the desktops, the scuffle ending with him prone and kicking the teacher in the lower belly, only because my aim was bad. In another instance, he again fell for a girl when Shirley and I put on boxing gloves and she decked me. It was virtually love at first sight. Sowell's propensity for mischief sometimes caused him to be kept after class, often with the lovely and imperturbable Miss Karoff doing homeroom duty. One time, as Sowell relates, she remarked sarcastically, "Well, here we are again, Sowell, just the 2 of us." "Good grief, Miss Karoff," I said. "If we keep on staying on After school together like this all the time, people will begin to talk. Without even looking up for her papers, she said, "We will just have to learn to live with the scandal." Sowell, recovering nicely academically, was, along with a few of his classmates who all took a rigorous entrance exam, eventually accepted into the prestigious public high school Stuyvesant High. But given that his commute was over an hour each day, that he became sick during part of the term, and that his life at home became a hell of constant bickering, he fell more and more behind at Stuyvesant and, not knowing what to do, finally left at age 16. He first worked at Western Telegram in dangerous parts of town, reading the telegrams frequently to people who couldn't. He started carrying a knife to protect himself. Enjoying drawing, he took a commercial art course. But his relationship with Aunt Molly continued to deteriorate, she becoming increasingly manipulative, demanding, and inflexible, and threatening to send him to reform school if he left. This, as he said, destroyed whatever vestige of respect for her that I had left. After a fight in which he threatened to throw a hammer at him, Thomas replying, "Throw it, but you had better not miss," he finally left, briefly living in a group home and then finding his own small apartment. As he said, "My room was probably not as large as a 9x12 rug. It contained a small bed, a chest, a chair, and a gas heater. It had no closet, just a nail on the back of the door, but that was sufficient for my wardrobe at the time." Now life would become even harder. His first hopes for employment were in writing and baseball. But given that none of his magazine submissions were accepted, and that, although a good hitter, in his tryout with the Brooklyn Dodgers, he misplayed a couple of ground balls, he was forced at first to get a part-time and then full-time job at a machine shop. He soon also, as he said, heard from the Civil Service Commission about the job I had applied for a year earlier. They now had an opening for a clerk in Washington. Moving there, he also continued his hobby of photography, the only problem in D.C. being the segregation. As he said, "When I went downtown taking pictures, I found it a pain that I could not simply walk into a restaurant and get something to eat when I was hungry." The next chapter in his Odyssey began with the arrival of his draft notice in the mail. Showing up at the Selective Service office, he then found that he was among the 25% of those who came that day automatically drafted into the Marine Corps to immediately begin 2 months of boot camp at Parris Island. What was that like? Never in my life did race mean less. The drill instructors saw their job as making everybody miserable, and they did so without regard to race, color, creed, or national origin. In terms of their objectives, their methods were a complete success. One of the guys in our platoon had once been in the Army, but he said the Army was never like this. As he'd shown in public school, Sowell quickly learned how the institution worked and what he could get away with. As he said, "In general, I tended to take the rules much more casually than the Marine Corps did." Here are some of the things he did. A. Since you weren't allowed to sleep in your tent during the day, even when not busy, he would anyway, and in order to be apprised of the approach of instructors to his tent, he would tie the flaps so that the instructor would get hung up in them, also putting a bucket near the entrance to make a noise so that he was quickly awakened and could jump to his feet. B. Every Marine had to do 2 weeks annually of requalifying his rifle scores. What Sowell did, instead of engaging in 2 weeks of wasted time, was to not give the sergeant in charge his Liberty card. When he showed up, betting that the sergeant would never expect someone to not report. And thus, as he said, I would never be absent when roll call was taken. The one drawback to this theory was that illegal possession of your own Liberty card was a court-martial offense. On the other hand, one cannot be faint-hearted. As he continued, the entire week when the other shooters were out doing their rifle exercises, I was off reading a new novel, From Here to Eternity, about military life. There was also time to spend in other parts of the base, photographing the scenery, or in the library, improving my mind. In the end, he ended up getting very high marks anyway, as he said, missing expert by only 1 point. It was a fitting climax to a successful 2 weeks. C. He pulled the exact same prank when figuring out whether he actually needed to clean his rifle for inspection, figuring that, even if he never cleaned it, between the low probability his rifle would be chosen for inspection, the relatively low amount of hours for punishment if he was caught, and the huge amount of relative time, a couple of hours each day, needed to clean it, it just wasn't worth the effort. Did it work? After a very long run of luck, however, I found a note on my bunk from the officer of the day. I read it to the guys in the barracks. Your rifle failed inspection, but I noticed that it still had grease from the rifle range on it. So obviously you must have gotten back here just before inspection. You'll get a warning this time. There's nothing like being both smart and lucky. D. Finally, he also simply skipped a commanding general's inspection, again using the assumption that they wouldn't check roll call. So after having been, perhaps a bit luckily, quite honorably discharged after his 2 years' service, our hero decided to continue improving his mind with more traditional methods by taking night courses at Howard University. It was about this time that he also became open to the world of classical music in general. It added a whole new dimension to my life. The Grieg Piano Concerto moved me more deeply than any other music I had ever heard. Most romantics, such as I, would agree that Grieg's Piano Concerto in A minor is utterly magnificent. At Howard, Sowell found the excellent English professor Sterling Brown, who showed him how a short story, which I had cherished all these years, was rubbish. He didn't say so, but he didn't have to. Once I realized how little I knew about writing, I could start to learn. Unfortunately, since most teachers there weren't of Brown's caliber, and few students evinced any burning passion to learn, the economist in him finally accepted, even though tuition there was extremely inexpensive, that there was just no way for my mind to develop in the stultifying atmosphere there. This had brutal implications financially. Fortunately, all that time spent studying, thinking, and reading during the years had paid off, as his SATs proved good enough for admission to Harvard. And so off to Cambridge he went. Once there, his first semester provided a brutal academic wake-up call with all D's and F's, his relative lack of preparation being revealed. He responded the next semester by constant studying, his practice being to come back from dinner to sleep, awakening in the middle of the night, rested, and studying until the early morning hours. By this method, he was able to gain ground, and when Christmas break arrived, he memorized German words by the hour, worked out math problems, taught myself to use a slide rule, and went through the chemistry textbook, solving every problem in it from cover to cover. As this relentless work pace went on, day after day, things began to fall into place. As he continued at Harvard, he found that the A's in economics came easiest, and being at this time a Marxist, decided for his senior's honors thesis to write about Marx. Overall, he found the intellectual attitude at Harvard too complacent and self-satisfied. As he said, I would encounter one of those thoroughly smug people who prompted the saying, "You can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much." By this time, he knew he wanted to understand more about economics, and so I applied to Columbia, Yale, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago in economics, and to Brandeis for a study in the history of ideas. By this time, I was fed up with Harvard. Now, he might say, tongue-in-cheek, that this is a man with high standards. But he's exactly right. That's how he became a great free market economist, by having high standards and sticking to them. After graduation, he got into Columbia, but when he headed to Morningside Heights, was disappointed to learn that George Stigler, with whom he had wanted to study, had moved to the University of Chicago. Not a problem. He quickly finished his master's in 9 months, worked during the summer at the civil service, and then in October, having gotten in by recommendation, started at the University of Chicago for the fall 1959 semester. In Chicago, one of his first courses was on price theory, offered by the famed monetary economist Milton Friedman, who was also his advisor. Even though the course was very hard, he enjoyed it, his only complaint about Chicago economics classes in general being that they were taught with equations and graphs, and very few concrete examples. As he said, "I liked theory as well as the next fellow, but a steady diet of nothing but abstractions became a little much." In fact, when he wrote a final paper for Friedman's class, he made it extra theoretical, deliberately larding it with huge numbers of equations and graphs. Friedman's response? "I got your heavy-handed humor." By this time, having worked during his summer breaks in various governmental agencies, such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor, and almost being finished with most of his PhD requirements, he applied for a position teaching economics at Douglas College in New Jersey, not realizing when initially applying that it was an all-white female college. But interviewing and getting the job, he decided to accept their offer. The student body there was composed of conscientious students by and large, and many were quite bright. But the focus of their efforts were good grades to take home, not a drive to understand or to develop their own analytical powers. They wanted to receive a prepackaged education, and that was not what I offered. In addition, sometimes the young ladies could be quite forward. As he said, "One day, one young lady came to my office and instead of sitting in the chair by the desk, sat up on the desk itself, striking a pose with her little buns toward me. 'Miss Wilson,' I said quietly, 'if I had a hat pin right now, do you know what I would do?' Instantly, she was off the desk and into the chair." Given the state of race relations in 1960, it was also understandable that he was cautious, never inviting the young ladies for a faculty-student get-together at his apartment, which annoyed them. Dr. Sowell moved on from Douglas when administrators pressured him into dumbing his courses down more for the worst students in his class. This he refused to do, leaving his resignation, but not before teaching his 2 spring semester classes, which went very well because the bad students had finally dropped the course. As he said, "Not only were the classes more intellectually stimulating for all, we enjoyed ourselves immensely in the process. There were so many outbursts of laughter in the classroom that one girl said, 'The teacher next door must wonder what is going on in here.'" His next stop was back to Howard University, this time as a teacher, but he soon learned that they had lied to him about his summer fellowship, and so, not wanting to leave abruptly as the fall semester started, had stayed. Unsatisfactory, too, was the cheating, which extended all the way to the typists and secretaries who leaked or sold exams to students in advance. In the end, although close to a third of his class failed, many of the students were saddened when he resigned, one saying, "How are we ever going to advance if people like you come here for 1 year and then leave?" The question really hit me. I had no answer for him then or now. From Howard, there was a stint as an economist, or really an all-purpose scholar in residence at AT&T, and from there back to academia in upstate New York at Cornell. As was by now routine, administrators soon became frustrated with his strict standards, trying in vain to talk him out of them. He continued in his spare time, finishing his dissertation on the economic principle called Say's Law, which is that increased supply creates its own demand. In family matters, being married, his young son was now at 3 years old, though well past the talkative twos, still not talking, but nonetheless quite intelligent in picking his child locks and understanding how mechanical items operated. But more on that later. Interestingly, Sowell's sojourn at Cornell came during the tumultuous year 68-69, when the campus erupted in a firestorm of protest initiated by rabble-rousing black students and encouraged by administrative cowardice. Our protagonist, in talking with the students, perhaps first formulated his concept of academic mismatch, which occurs in any program, such as with affirmative action, when students who aren't prepared for the rigor and speed of an elite university start falling behind. In this case, they expressed their dismay by political unrest and aggressiveness. As problems continued to build with the Cornell administration, they interfering with his use of Rockefeller Foundation funds for funding travel arrangements for visiting students and preventing him from dismissing a troublesome student, he submitted his resignation and left at the end of the 68-69 year, even though many of his students were happy and the Rockefeller Foundation pleased. But now back to his non-talkative son. On the advice of an advisor at the University of Chicago, he stopped trying to pressure him to talk at all. And then a bit later, simply started recording and playing back words that his son had said. His son found this all amusing, enjoying the process, and talking a bit too, and as time went on, finally started talking normally. And finally, too, another success. The PhD, for which I had worked so long and hard, was officially awarded in December 1968, but now its value and the career it opened up to me seemed more and more questionable. I did not go to the commencement ceremonies at the University of Chicago, but had the degree mailed to me like my previous degrees from Harvard and Columbia. After spending the summer teaching at UCLA and meeting noted free market economist Walter Williams for the first time, who had also started out as a Marxist, Sowell headed off for the fall semester at Brandeis, which appointment lasted a year. Fortunately, with Brandeis, for the first time, I left an academic institution with goodwill all around and with a sense of regret at leaving a fine bunch of colleagues. And it wasn't long before he finally ended up where he's remained since then at the Hoover institution. The last third of the book covers a teaching stint at UCLA before he again became disgusted with a failure to support him in an incident with a disruptive student, his discovery of the extraordinary black public high school Dunbar, extraordinary only before it was destroyed by public school officials in Washington, D.C., his fight against the notion that integration per se would be a solution to black educational problems, a stint at the Urban Institute to do research, also being, as he was, at AT&T, their scholar in residence, an attempt by the Ford Foundation administration to nominate him as one of 5 members of the Federal Trade Commission, he discovering, however, that White House officials had misled him during the process, leading him to pull out. More on the success of his now talkative son, who became a computer programmer. Dr. Sowell subsequently writing 2 books about late-talking children. Various unsuccessful attempts by well-meaning friends to inveigle him in the political process. An attempt by the Reagan campaign to hire him as a consultant. And finally, the necessity, as he became ever more well-known, to unlist his phone number. In summary, while only someone who knows Dr. Sowell better than I could know how consistently objective his own coverage of himself has been, as an autobiography, I would give this book an A- for its clear and engaging prose, its ever-present and highly effective humor, and the illumination of many aspects of his life, both personal and professional, through the growth of his character and knowledge. The only potential criticism is that Dr. Sowell never really puts himself in a negative light, though we could argue perhaps that this is more the purpose of a biography, not an autobiography. On the note of happiness that comes when I discover yet another book illustrating and celebrating human freedom and achievement, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.